Hi, it's Nicole from A Day of Small Things. Welcome back to this mini-series on Jane Eyre. We're looking at 4 characters in this series, specifically at their Christian worldviews. The episodes on Mr. Brocklehurst and Helen Burns are already out. Thank you for your encouragement and lovely comments. We'll look at St. John Rivers today and Mr. Rochester next week. Charlotte Brontë was the daughter of an Irish Anglican clergyman, and you can tell from the novel that she knew her Bible well. Jane Eyre quotes and alludes to the passages in the Bible more than almost any other novel I've read. You might have a vague impression that all Christians believe more or less the same things and one Christian would look similar to another, but Charlotte Brontë shows us in the novel that's certainly not the case. St. John Rivers appears in the last quarter of the book after Jane runs away from Thornfield Hall. He and his 2 sisters take Jane into their home as she nearly dies of cold and hunger after wandering about desperately for 2 days. Rivers is a young, intelligent and serious clergyman and soon offers Jane a home and work as a school teacher for the girls from the villages. And, spoiler alert, eventually they found out they are cousins. He offers to marry her and go to India as missionaries, but goes alone in the end. Rivers takes part in a big proportion of the storyline and is a more complicated Christian character compared to Mr. Brocklehurst or Helen Burns. My first impression was that he's precisely as Jane observes initially, restless, hard and eager. He would trample down every obstacle in his way to achieve his purpose. But some of his speeches made me think he could also be genuinely concerned about the mission work and is a single-minded and zealous man. But however genuine he is towards God's mission in India, his views on mission work, marriage and love are definitely problematic. St. John Rivers is a clergyman like Mr. Brocklehurst, but unlike Mr. Brocklehurst, Rivers' way of life is more consistent with his belief. He excellently and powerfully preaches Calvinistic doctrines in his sermons that thrill the heart and astonish the mind. He diligently does his pastoral duty by visiting all the poor and needy in his parish. He lives in an old family house without many worldly belongings or concerns. Rivers is preparing to become a missionary to India when he meets Jane. I want to believe that he's genuine in his endeavor. Many passages review this aspect of Rivers, but his tunnel vision on this single issue, namely to proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth, has blinded him to other equally essential commands in the Bible. For example, the greatest commandments, according to Jesus, are to love your God and love your neighbors. However, in Rivers' own words, you have but one end to keep in view: how the work you have undertaken can best be done. Rivers is so fixated on the work itself, he forgets the work is the means, not the end. The end is love. If you're familiar with the confession prayer, you'd know that it says, "We confess that we have sinned against you," meaning God, "in thought, word and deed." Rivers is an example of a model Christian in all his deeds. A reader of Jane Eyre can pretty confidently say that Rivers rarely sinned against God indeed. As Jane observes, he is zealous in his ministerial labours and blameless in his life and habits. Unlike Mr. Rochester, he had not spent his youth with wine and women and had not tried to deceive Jane into a double marriage. But how about his thought and word? My first impression, Rivers feels self-centered in his religion. Not selfish. Selfish is conduct towards other people, grabbing things that benefit oneself and not being considerate to others. Rivers is mostly not selfish towards people. He can be generous with his time and money towards his parishioners because that's the right thing to do. However, later on his selfishness did come through when he insisted on Jane marrying him. I see that as a more extreme example of his religious self-centeredness. What do I mean? I'll give you a few examples, but in brief, Christianity as a religion is his means to achieve his desires. A large proportion of his time appeared devoted to visiting the sick and poor among the scattered population of his parish. Sometimes when the day was very unfavorable, his sisters would expostulate. He would then say, with a peculiar smile, more solemn than cheerful, "And if I let a gust of wind or a sprinkling of rain turn me aside from these easy tasks, what preparation would such sloth be for the future I propose for myself?" Note how he says, "I propose to myself." He was intensely miserable in his daily work as a clergyman because he was bored to death and he did not know what to do with his energy and talent in the middle of the Yorkshire moors. What did he truly want? "I burned for the more active life of the world, for the more exciting toils of a literary career, for the destiny of an artist, author, orator, anything rather than that of a priest. Yes, the heart of a politician, of a soldier, of a votary of glory, a lover of renown, a luster after power, beat under my curate surplice." So one day suddenly the idea dawned on him that he should become a missionary because the profession required a combination of skills and strengths that suited him perfectly. "My cramped existence all at once spread out to a plain without bounds. My powers heard a call from heaven to rise, gather their full strength, spread their wings, and mount beyond ken. God had an errand for me, to bear which afar, to deliver it well, skill and strength, courage and eloquence, the best qualifications of soldier, statesman, and orator were all needed, for these all center in the good missionary." That to me is the wrong way of approaching the question of whether I should become a missionary. Shouldn't the question be, what can I do so more people can hear the good news of Jesus? I'll go to the East as a missionary. Rather than, I want to be a soldier, statesman, and orator, what work can I do to fit all those categories? I know, I'll become a missionary. Rosamund Oliver is a character that the 2011 film adaptation doesn't even hint at. It's a shame because in the film, Rivers asking Jane to marry him can look quite genuine, but the book gives no illusion of that. Rosamund was the young woman Rivers loved passionately. Seeing her, his hand would tremble and his eyes burn. But Rivers refused Rosamund because he was going away and she would not make me a good wife. And later, when he insisted that Jane must marry him, "A part of me you must become, we must be married," it is because he judged Jane a useful and obedient worker. But taking a single woman to a mission field as a companion is unacceptable. Jane saw this very clearly in her response to Rivers. This is Rivers speaking. "Do you think God will be satisfied with half an oblation? Will he accept a mutilated sacrifice? It is the cause of God I advocate. It is under his standard I enlist you. I cannot accept on his behalf a divided allegiance. It must be entire." I think this is when Jane said, "I can't go with you as a wife, but I will go with you as a sister." Jane said, "Oh, I will give my heart to God," I said. "You do not want it." Rivers did not ask Jane to marry him because of love. He just needed someone to obey and labor under his command. That, to me, is selfish. After explaining that even their idea of love is different, let alone practicing it in real life, Jane said, "My dear cousin, abandon your scheme of marriage. Forget it." "No," said Rivers, "it is a long-cherished scheme, and the only one which can secure my great end." That's another unmistakable example of his selfishness. Marrying Jane was to complete a scheme to secure his egoistic plan. How he forced his will on Jane as if it were God's will. He didn't hesitate to be selfish in God's name. Do not forget that if you reject it, it is not me you deny, but God. Refuse to be my wife, and you limit yourself forever to a track of selfish ease and barren obscurity. Tremble, lest in that case you should be numbered with those who have denied the faith and are worse than infidels. In other words, if you don't agree to marry me and go on this mission trip with me, you are doomed to a useless life and will end up in hell. By this point, he was just as detestable as Mr. Brocklehurst. He claimed Jane's obedience in surrendering her life to his will, and he used God's name to achieve his purpose. When his will was finally rejected by Jane, he turned dismissive, condescending, resentful, cold, and he ignored her as if she didn't exist. There was no forgiveness, reconciliation, or softening, for cordiality would not warm, nor tears move him. We have said a lot about Rivers' selfishness in demanding Jane marry him. In the last section, I want to compare Rivers' view and the Bible's view on love and marriage. Let's see Rivers' own words on this subject before we argue against him. Rivers speaks to Jane. "God and nature intended you for a missionary's wife. It is not personal, but mental endowments they have given you. You are formed for labor, not for love. A missionary's wife you shall be. You shall be mine. I claim you, not for my pleasure, but for my sovereign service. I, too, do not want a sister. A sister might any day be taken from me. I want a wife, the sole helpmeet I can influence efficiently in life and return absolutely till death. Again, I tell you, it is not the insignificant private individual, the mere man with the man's selfish senses. I wish to mate, it is the missionary." Rivers does not want affection from his wife, only obedience and labor are required. A robot would suit him perfectly. Jane understands his proposal very well. She says to herself, "He prizes me as a soldier would a good weapon," and that is all. The Bible commands, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." When Christ was on earth with his disciples, he was their close friend and never used them as minions. He was not a taskmaster or a slave driver. He is gentle and lowly in heart. For love between husband and wife, Song of Songs in the Bible gives a romantic image. Genesis chapter 2 is also affectionate. God saw man alone was not good, so he created a woman for him. When God brought her to the man, he was delighted and became a poet on the spot. "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." The first love poem in history. Comparing Genesis chapter 2 or Song of Songs to Rivers' version of love and reasoning for marriage, I think he is mistaken. He never utters a loving word to Jane or about Jane. He observes and judges her appearance, works, and character objectively and coolly. If you want to see a contrast, Mr. Rochester's monologue on page 304 is a good example of affection. He likens her to a finch, tiny and frail in frame, but strong in mind. He hears her speak and watches the subtle changes in her facial expression, and all her voice and images are stored away frame by frame in his heart. He's curious, attracted, and fascinated with her every move. Snarl as I would, you showed no surprise, fear, annoyance, or displeasure at my remoteness. You watched me, and now and then smiled at me with a simple yet sagacious grace I cannot describe. I was at once content and stimulated with what I saw. I liked what I had seen and wished to see more. It makes me happy to just see her, to watch her, knowing she's around, and I always want to spend more time with her, and I'm never bored of her company. If I were Jane, I would also prefer Rochester to Rivers. Who wouldn't? I don't want to be loved because I'm useful. I want to be loved because you delight in me. And it's mind-blowing to know that this is how God sees me and loves me. I don't like St. John Rivers very much, and I admire Jane for standing up to him by her conscience and conviction. It can't be easy. I wonder if that alone says something about the strength of Jane's mind and character. I want to conclude with a wonderful comment from a viewer. St. John Rivers wished to become a missionary to India. Here's someone from India responding to a British missionary like Rivers. Anjali said, in a Bible study, the topic of styles of evangelism came up, and she shared how awful, almost traumatic reading Rivers in Jane Eyre was for her. Anjali is from a Hindu background and became a Christian as an adult, so she can see both sides of the things, and she said, St. John just hurt my heart. And she explained really movingly that missionary work should be done with genuine love and not manipulation, which is the exact opposite of how St. John treated Jane Eyre. If he uses fear and shame to pressure Jane into marriage, he is likely to use fear and shame to pressure people into Christianity. That's wrong, and that's not Christ's way. Anjali said, there is such a stark difference between Christ's sacrificial love and the ego, ambition, personal glory that can sometimes be involved with some missionary activities. I myself sometimes picked up on this sense of superiority or self-serving ambition in the past when people tried to convert me, and that actually had put me off Christianity rather than it had ever attracted me. Rivers and missionaries like him are misrepresenting Christianity with the devastating consequence of pushing people away. Knowing how precious Christ and his gospel are, the idea of anything or anyone hindering it is painful. For Anjali, it was no longer just about St. John. It was about who was claiming to pastor or minister on behalf of Christ and what healing versus damage he could do in the name of Christ. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Anjali. I love how carefully you think about literature and life, drawing out things that a lot of us haven't seen or thought about at all. Anjali said more in her comments as well. If you're interested, please read the whole thread. Next week is our last episode. We'll see Mr. Rochester and how he, the lost sheep, the prodigal son, an unlikely candidate in comparison to Mr. Brocklehurst and St. John Rivers, gets the idea of love and grace pretty spot on. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.